Hello and welcome back to the final part of this ec3 lecture on monetary policy. In this final part, we look at the effects of inflation. So, inflation is like an important output from this ADS model. It gives you an idea of how these events and policies are going to play out in terms of price changes. It shows us that it's possible to stimulate output by increasing aggregate demands by either fiscal or monetary policy or both. But it shows you, unfortunately, in the long run, that won't affect output. It will inflation. So both expansionary fiscal and monetary policy have implications for inflation. And in fact, so do contractionary policy, but the contractionary policy in both cases will bring inflation down. Expansionary policy will push it up. A school of economists or a school of thought within economics called monetarism believes that the money supply is directly linked to inflation, and so they're quite hostile to this idea because of the inflationary effects, and they believe that actually you can trace it directly to the money supply. Certainly, it doesn't need much sophistication just to stick for all countries the inflation rates. It's got the kind of logarithmic scale that we've been seeing in the, unfortunately, very tragic diagrams going around recently about coronavirus cases and mortality. That's logarithmic. Similarly this way, just to linearize it. But the picture's the same, is that countries that got money supply growing quickly tend to have higher inflation rates. So it's pretty clear there is some kind of positive correlation, but it's not perfect. For example, the trend is clearly upwards, but you have countries like Georgia, which have got relatively high inflation, but I can't see what to compare it with. I was going to say compare it with this one, I'm not sure what it is. But compared to this country here, they got much higher inflation, but lower money supply growth. So it's not a hard and fast rule. You get patterns the other way. But overall, the pattern is very clear. It does seem to be a positive relationship. But what causes that is the question. So governments are almost always under political pressure to increase money supply because of the monetary policy effects. It helps output, helps employment. So expansionary monetary policy is something that they're under pressure of doing. But it does have this risk, which the ADAS model shows, of creating inflation. Now, because of that, one solution that's been widely adopted is to give the central bank power to independently control interest rates. Because the central bank, the logic is, they can look at it in terms of, okay, what's going to cause undesirably high inflation and how are we going to limit the rise in the money supply so as not to make that to happen. And because they're independent, they don't care about voters and other interest groups saying, hey, we need to have more government expenditure on this, that and the other to boost employment. The central bank doesn't have that political pressure. It can just consider what rate of monetary expansion do we need to make sure inflation stays within a desirable range. So the way it works is the government sets a target level, usually a target band, so between 0 and 2 or 2 and 4, whatever. Central bank then decides the interest rates, which will help meet that. It doesn't care about political pressure. It reduces the risk that you can get into an inflationary cycle due to political weakness. And when you look back at episodes of where countries have really struggled to get out of high inflation, it's usually because they've had forces pushing them towards spending money from their political backers. But why care about inflation? Why not let it go? And people have tried to categorize the costs to society of inflation in these different ways. Again, some are very up to date, some are more out of date. So shoe leather cost is one of the more outdated ones. It's just as the value of money goes down, you need more frequently go to the bank. So it's literally called shoe leather. You've got to traipse to the cash point and back more often to get money out. So that's a less up to date one these days because things can be adapted automatically. But the cost of having to make those adaptations in your accessing your accounts, even if it's not literally walking. Menu costs, just even with everything on the internet these days, there are many things that are still printed. Even when online, there's a cost to making sure that it's continually updated to reflect the latest prices. So you have to literally you can't print anything out, otherwise you have to go and change it again. So there's a cost to keeping up to date with the prices you're publicising to people, because even if it's electronic, if it's literally changing within the day or within the week, you've got to send out notifications to all those people saying, hey, this stuff is now costing more. So menu cost is another cost. Relative price distortions is a consequence almost of that what really matters is relative prices, as we discussed with the short run aggregate supply. If your price is getting, if the price of what you're producing should be going up because the price of everything is going up in the economy, but for some reason you've already released your prices for the year, then suddenly your stuff's going to seem cheap, so you'll sell more. But then you won't earn enough from that to pay for your costs. So it causes these distortions. So the relative prices are what we think reflects the real costs of production of different things, and also reflects the amount that people want different things. So it should efficiently allocate the stuff that's being produced and demanded in society. But once those relative price distortions get all affected by the fact that you just simply can't keep up with changes in prices to what they should be, you get these relative price distortions and things are no longer efficient. So you get oversupply of stuff that people don't want, and vice versa. So going back to ec2, that causes microeconomic inefficiencies and welfare losses. The specific thing, those 1 to 3 applies to everywhere. The specific thing that applies to poor people in poor countries, and therefore that's the real human impact one, is that higher inflation generally is associated with higher prices. Because even though, for example, among the poorest people in the world are poor farmers working their lands, the poorest people in the world are the people that don't even grow enough food to eat themselves. They rely on working for farmers, scraping together some earning, and then buying some food, particularly in the hungry season. For those guys, when the price of food goes up, just like the very poor urban people, when the price of food goes up, they are really in a bad place. So an increase in prices, serious impacts on the very poorest people in the world. And then finally, of course, that's inflation. We have cases of hyperinflation. Hi, by the way, this is the symbol used to stand for inflation. If inflation is bigger than 50% per month, then technically that's called hyperinflation. In that situation, all those things above, which you say, okay, this is a bit of a pain, all those costs suddenly become an absolute nightmare. Even the stupid one about having to go to the bank suddenly becomes real. You suddenly find the money that you took out a couple of days ago to buy a moped won't buy you a packet of cigarettes. So those costs, plus you can no longer use money to store your wealth. So as soon as you get it, you've got to spend it or transform it into another form instantly, because in a couple of days' time, that wealth is nixed by a large percentage. Which has the effect of saying, well, people don't even start using it for transactions. As soon as you get some cash, you have to use it now for a transaction. If it's not going to be now, you have to change it as quickly as possible, possibly into goods that you can exchange or some stable foreign currency. So that has effects of destroying the value of your own currency, and also increasing, if there's any limits, creating a whole parallel market in the foreign currency. So how do you get into this disastrous situation? It's almost always caused or associated with colossal growth in the money supply. So all those methods we looked at before about how the money supply can be technically manipulated, country gets into a desperate situation, they can't pay the police, which they need to keep themselves in power, then they just start to print money, create money electronically or physically to pay essential people, and that price level is always just shoots up. And then of course, then they need to print more money because that money is no longer enough, and you get into this spiral. And they create it when they have to resort to that printing money because they can't just raise taxes or sell bonds. Because a normal government, if people trust the bonds they're issuing, they need to borrow money, they just issue some bonds on the international markets. Or if they've got a wealthy, productive economy, the well-developed tax system, they just put taxes up. So some spending increases are essential, and they have to do it at the end of the day just by printing the money. So the good news is it's dead simple to start it. You just reverse it, stop printing the money. Problem is, it's really, really tough to do it, as all the examples we've had show, because you suddenly have to tell the police that are keeping the food writers from your palace that they're no longer going to be paid what they're expected to get. And you may find that you're outside your palace quite soon, as the most recent example was has happened in Sudan, when Bashir, where everybody thought would be brought down because of the appalling violence that he committed around the country and corruption, was finally brought down just by price of bread riots, and middle classes finding they were short of food and could no longer afford to buy the way out of it. Okay, go back to the long run. Why in my couple of lectures have I gone on and on about these short run fluctuations which we can try and manage by influencing fiscal and monetary policy? Well, this my example from in the year 2000, it's just struck me such a lot. I've never forgotten it. The ambassador for Brazil was on the radio, and he said, well, in 2000 we were the world's 13th biggest economy, and it was 2012, it wasn't that long ago. In 2012 he was on the radio saying, well, now we've just overtaken you guys in the UK, we're now a bigger economy than the UK. And he was asked about the factors, and I was expecting he'd say something about the natural resources they have, the more stable government they had, after the years of military government and the rest of it, and then the various financial crises they've solved and got over. And his answer was simple. He said that macroeconomic stability. So it wasn't so much about these long-term investment things that was the primary source. The primary source was when you were back in the days of 85% per month inflation, nobody can think about the future. It's just impossible to have any sensible planning. So he said getting macroeconomic stability, it looks like a short-term thing, but that gives people the space and the trust in the future to plan and invest. And Brazil was a success story at that stage. Of course, more recently it's had problems, but it overtook us in 2012. Okay, so to summarise the effects of inflation, there's a link to fiscal and monetary policies as shown in the IDAS model. There are big social costs, including especially the costs on the very poorest people who rely on cash transactions to get the basic essentials of life. And then there's a huge danger of hyperinflation when things get out of control, and the fact that when you get into high inflation and towards hyperinflation, even this short-term stuff is a disaster for the future, the growth that you need in order to grow your economy and hopefully reduce poverty. So, summary. As we saw in the fiscal policy lecture, fiscal policy potentially very powerful. There are limits as well as the crowding out, because poor governments have limited capacity to spend, and they're also reliant on donors. Monetary policy is an alternative, the main alternative. That's about control of the money supply and money markets and interest rates. We can add that into the ISLM model, and it affects demand for output and the interest rate in the ISLM model. And whereas the fiscal policy is modelled by moving this part, the ISLM line, monetary policy is modelled by moving the LM line. But as we saw, the effect of monetary policy is determined by the slope of the ISLM and vice versa. So there's an interaction between fiscal and monetary policy, whichever one you decide to lose. Then finally we say, well, what about inflation and changes in the price level? We can look at that using the ADAS model. An advantage of this is, as well as taking into account inflation, it gives you a picture of the long run. So how do things pan out in the short run, and what are the expectations of the long run adjustment? And this you can use to analyse policy and also external events, shocks, both in the short and the long run. And then finished off by looking at, now we've brought in price level, what are the implications of the price level and inflation, both in the short term and the long term, and particularly on poor people.
I hope you have found these lectures on fiscal and monetary policy interesting. If you can become familiar with the simple models presented, then you should find you're much more able to understand real-world debates about national economic policy in different countries. Please do bring along any questions you have to the live sessions, where I look forward to discussing these ideas with you. Thank you for watching.